Hey everybody, Deathblade here. I'm coming at you with a movie review, which is something I don't do much of. I have my Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon 2 breakdown. I hated that movie. For the Paper Tigers, I am going to handle this sort of the way that I've been doing my book reviews, which is an assessment, a spoiler-free summary, and then talking about what I liked and what I didn't like. So The Paper Tigers is a 2020 martial arts action comedy starring mostly not really very famous actors. I think probably the most well-known is Ron Yuen, who is a very prolific actor. My basic assessment is thumbs in the middle. I did enjoy it, but there were a lot of things, or some pretty big things about it that I didn't like. I think it's one of those movies that if you have a few beers, maybe just kind of relax and just enjoy the movie for what it is, kind of fun and funny, then it's fine. As long as you don't think too deeply about what's actually going on in the movie. And I'm not talking about plot-wise. I'll get to that in a minute. You'll see what I mean. But basically, if you are a fan of kind of martial arts comedies, Jackie Chan stuff, and I'm not saying this is a Jackie Chan movie. I'm just saying mixing comedy and martial arts, if you like that kind of stuff, then this is probably worth picking up. It's a fun movie, and it's enjoyable. It's not the most horrible disaster in the entire world. But like I said, there are some things about it that I didn't like, and if you're a person who cares a lot about storytelling and characters and whatnot, then you might agree with me, you might not. We'll see by the end of this video. So let's get into the basic summary, and this is going to be spoiler-free. This is basically kind of what you can get on the summary on Amazon or in the back of the DVD cartridge. Basically, the story is about three martial arts experts, or at least they used to be experts in the 80s. Fast forward 30 years, they're now middle-aged. One of them has a kid. One of them is basically crippled, and another one has kind of veered off his original martial arts path to kind of become a coach and focus more on MMA. And basically their master gets killed. This happens in the opening scene, so not a big spoiler. And they, after having been going their separate ways for many, many years, kind of all get back together to try to solve the mystery of their master's death. That's pretty much the gist of the story. There is a subplot with the main character having to deal with his family and his son and being a father, but they all kind of tie together in the end. And that's basically the summary. It is, like I said before, it's a fun movie, it's funny, and it's worth giving a shot if you like that kind of stuff. Let's get into what I liked and what I didn't like. In terms of what I liked, number one is the fighting sequences and the action was pretty well done. I don't know anything about the lead actor. The story is primarily about one specific character, Danny. The other two characters are supporting characters, and they help him throughout his journey. I don't know anything about the lead actor as to whether or not he has martial arts training. I'm not an expert martial artist, so I can't tell just by watching a fight scene. My impression is that he is not really a trained martial artist. But that said, the fight scenes were pretty cool. I really did like that. I was actually what kind of prompted me to watch this movie. I don't watch movies very often nowadays because I don't have time. But when I was just scrolling past it in Netflix, one of the fight scenes in the movie kind of popped up. It caught my eye, and I found myself watching this fight scene in like the preview section of Netflix for almost the entire thing until it reset. And I was like, oh wow, I can't believe I was just hooked by that fight scene. And so I went back, and that's what prompted me to watch the movie. And so there's that. I also like the setting, which is Chinatown. I am a sucker for Chinatown movies. Chinatown has always fascinated me. I lived in the Manhattan Chinatown, the section that is not the tourist section. I lived in the Little Fuzhou section, which is around East Broadway. And I love life in Chinatown, and I still just really like anything that has to do with Chinatown, the mix between East and West. And depending on which Chinatown you're in, there's going to be a mix of different Chinese dialects and different Chinese subcultures. I just really like that stuff, and so if there's a movie set in Chinatown that's done well, I really like it, and so I actually did like that aspect. I'm going to now have to spoil one of the things that I didn't like to talk about something that I did like. Basically, I didn't very much like the main character, Danny, as he was portrayed, but we'll get to that in a second. I said that because I got to point out that I did like the character played by Ron Yuen. I think his name was Hing, Hing. He is kind of like, I mentioned before, he has a bad knee. He literally like limps the entire movie, but so he doesn't really do much in the way of fighting because he basically can't. But his character in the movie, I think, was portrayed very well. I liked his character the most. He was the most likable, the most sincere. He was the one that was trying to work hard to get the others to join him to avenge the master's death, or at least find out what happened to the master. And he was the most realistic and likable character. So I actually liked him a lot. Now let's get into the things that I didn't like. As I mentioned before, I really didn't like the main character, Danny. Now I'm not talking about the actor's performance. I think the actor did a great job with the script he was given, but in terms of how the story arc played out, it just didn't really It just didn't do anything for me. Now we're going to get into spoilers at this point. If you do not want any spoilers, I would suggest stopping the video right now. Basically, what I didn't like about Danny's character is that he didn't really grow in the movie at all. He starts out as a really bad father. Now, granted, he's not like abusive or anything like that, but it makes very obvious in the opening scene of the movie, his opening scene, that he puts everything above his son. He's divorced and he has 50-50 custody, and yet he doesn't live up to his promises to his kid. He lets his child down. He even gets his kid to lie for him. Now, these things are all addressed later, but it happens so quickly that it doesn't make up for the rest of the movie. For basically the majority of the movie, it's I think an hour and 15 or 20 minutes runtime. Maybe it's an hour and 30 minutes, I forget. But for basically the first 3/4 or 4/5 of the movie, he continuously is basically a bad dad. There's basically 2 moments where they try to redeem him, yet they completely fall flat as far as I'm concerned. First moment is basically for most of the movie, the dad, Danny, is trying to tell his kid to not fight people because he doesn't want his kid to follow his own path. That in itself, I don't think is something that should be looked down on. I don't think that it's a bad thing to tell kids you shouldn't get into fights. He does kind of push it a little far by saying you should just run away no matter what. Then, at a certain point in the movie, Danny experiences his change, and then he calls his son, and he basically says, if anybody causes problems for you or your mom or anybody you love, ball your hand into a fist and punch him in the face as hard as you can. And that was kind of an odd thing. Like, I get where they were trying to go with it because he was trying to basically teach his kid to stand up for himself. It came across as really weird to me because the whole movie is about martial arts and honor and not using martial arts to just fight people. That was something that the 3 Paper Tigers master continuously taught them. And yet he didn't really impart that message to his kid. He kind of called his kid in a moment where Danny thinks he might die. And so this theoretically could be his parting message to his kid before he dies, and he basically just tells him, never mind, you should just go fight people. I don't know, it kind of fell flat for me. Then they try to, in basically the very last scene of the movie, say, oh, well, as it turns out, Danny turns out to be a good father after all, and he is with his kid and all this stuff. But there wasn't anything that really showed to me that he had actually changed, except for that one tense moment where he calls his son and says, you should fight people after all. So yeah, I didn't really like the character or the way it was portrayed. One other thing that I didn't like, and speaking of the characters, there's one white guy in the movie, and on the one hand, he is pretty funny, the way that they portray him. I did laugh, and I wasn't offended or anything, but basically, this is a guy he's a white guy who takes Chinese culture and Chinese martial arts extremely seriously to the point where he can speak Cantonese. A pretty amazing thing to do. He also takes martial arts very seriously. In the early part of the movie, he gets repeatedly beat up by Danny. Then later on, he kind of continues on a path of true martial arts and, becomes a martial arts teacher and whatnot, while Danny and his friends kind of go off and just lose their martial arts and become regular middle-aged people. But this character is the butt of pretty much every joke, and they make fun of the fact repeatedly that he knows so much about Chinese culture and that he takes martial arts seriously. It was funny, but as somebody who has also gone down the path of learning Chinese and taking Chinese culture seriously, it kind of annoyed me that they were making so much fun of it. And similar to what they did with Danny, at the very, very, very last minute, they kind of tried to change it and be like, well, in the end, he's actually pretty cool after all. But it was literally tacked on at the very end to the point where I don't think it made up for the entire hour before that, where they were constantly making fun of him and calling him names and whatnot. So that part, I wasn't offended by it, but I was just kind of annoyed, I guess you could say. There is one other specific thing that I didn't like. I'm going to make a separate video on that because I think that falls more in line with my Chinese fantasy novel FAQ. I'll spoil it really quickly. I didn't like the fact that they transliterated some very key Chinese terms. They didn't explain what they were. They just had the characters say the Chinese version. I really didn't like that, and so I'll do a separate video on that. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this kind of movie review. I may do this stuff more often in the future. Let me know if you like it, and I will see you next time. Gautzla.